Welcome back. This will be the third and final webinar presentation by yours truly, Melinda Pettingill. Just as a reminder, I'm currently the clinical director at the Rape Recovery Center. Have spent a majority of my career in trauma work, and specifically understanding the implications for adverse childhood experiences on our fully developed brain. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out my mic here. So we're going to be incorporating that into our conversation today. We're going to be talking about adults molested as children. But another way I want to conceptualize that is really we're talking about complex trauma survivors. And just as a reminder, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but just as a reminder, when we look at the issue of trauma, we have found as a nation, really worldwide, when we're able to conceptualize trauma and expand our definition of it from that initial thought of big, dangerous, life-threatening experiences like war, rape, accidents, terminal illnesses, etc. When we're able to expand that definition to include what we call, those are big T traumas, the life-threatening ones. The little T traumas are everyday life occurrences, life experiences that really fundamentally shift or change our understanding of ourselves or the world around us. So that really kind of then broadens the whole spectrum, right? If I'm working with someone whose primary caregiver is their grandmother who watches them all day, every day, and their grandmother dies suddenly. You know, some people might not interpret that as trauma. Some people might, but really it fundamentally shifts and changes my understanding of myself or the world around me. So we're going to be working from that lens today, that trauma is really something that shifts or changes our understanding of ourselves or the world around us. Now, this gets really tricky when we're looking at it through the lens of a child, right? Because it's the period of time where we're required to organize the most information and store it in our brains, and we have the least amount of resources to do that. Right? So if all day, every day, I'm exposed to material and information, I get used to storing it. For children, almost everything new they're exposed to is new, and they're forced to make sense of it. When those things shift or change their understanding of themselves or the world around them, they have to organize material they're not really prepared to organize. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. When I say adults molested as children, that's one form of complex trauma. But I'm going to be asking you to think a little bit more broadly about the idea of complex trauma in general. If you, Morgan, as an administrative worker at a rape crisis center, or you, Sterling, as a social worker, a crisis worker at a hospital, as a child were exposed to things you weren't certain how to make sense of, they absolutely shifted or changed your worldview or your understanding of yourself. So I'm going to be asking you that are here with me today, and also those of you that are watching over the World Wide Web. I know it sounds funny, but I like to say it. Those of you that are watching online, if you can really think about that for yourself, we synthesize this material and internalize it better when we do look at it through ourselves and through our own development, our own lived experience. So if you find yourself wandering back to your childhood, that's okay. I'm asking you to do that because I'm inducing on purpose the experience that many of our survivors have. So you're welcome ahead of time. All right. So I really love this slide up here. You can spend a lifetime trying to forget a few minutes of your childhood. I think that really does bring up that sort of tug in all of us where we just want to kind of take care of children. Everyone, even people who've fundamentally decided they're never having children, can really rally behind the birth of a baby, right? It means something to us. We show up, there's an infant, and we're like, oh God, you're so vulnerable and have not been tainted by the suffering of the world yet, and you're so cute. And for some reason, babies speak to us. Something about them we connect to. My argument would be we connect to their vulnerability, and it allows us to connect to our own. But I think there are other reasons too. Um, I want you to think about children, young people that you know in your life. Um, do each of you know and or interact with young children regularly?
Not super regularly, but I definitely, semi-regularly.
Yeah, it definitely isn't uncommon for me.
Okay, so not too regularly. Dang, I should have brought pictures of my children to put up here on
I
the.
can think of some.
Okay,
I can imagine them.
it's not a big deal, but for those of you that are listening from home or your office, I do want you to remain connected to kind of children that you know. It's more helpful when we can make children a part of our lived experience as opposed to kind of separating these people from us. So I like the slide in front of us. You can spend a lifetime trying to forget a few minutes of your childhood, but there's a quote I like even more that I'm going to share with you. That came from one of my very favorite child psychologists. She says, "It doesn't matter what happened to you; it matters how you remember it." And I think that's what we're working with complex trauma. If any of you have had the experience where you are reliving an experience you had in your life with one of your siblings or one of your parents, and they have a very different version of what happened than you do, have either of you had that experience?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yep, I've definitely had that.
I know. Even I'll be talking to my mom, and, I had this conversation with my mom a couple weeks ago where I was like, "Do you remember that car wreck we got in when we were little?" And she's like, "You weren't there." And I was like, "Wait, what?" And she's like, "You weren't there. We got in this car wreck. We were like driving down this like hill. It was snowy." Da, da. I'm like, "Mom, I remember that." And she's like, "No, there was a settlement for the insurance company for everyone in the car, and you got nothing. You weren't there." And I really had to take a step back and be like, "Oh my God." That experience of my brothers coming home and describing in detail, and I was really little, probably 4 or 5. I I kind of stored it. It was so traumatic for me that I stored it as if I was there, and I wasn't. Now, I think it becomes tricky because everyone's version, their understanding of their lived experience looks different. So when I sit across from a client, I really do say it doesn't matter to me what actually happened. If we brought somebody else in and we're like duking it out, fighting it out, what I'm looking for is how did your brain store it? I want to work with what was stored. What was stored is what's impacting you, not what happened. And also, it doesn't matter how many witnesses I bring into the space. Everyone has their own version of reality, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. It doesn't matter what happened to you, it matters how you remember it. It matters how it was stored. And jumping right into that, in our line of work, especially at the Rape Recovery Center, we typically work with trauma survivors and complex trauma survivors. Both are trauma survivors, right? But I notice a vastly different experience of someone that comes into the center because they had a relatively well-attached childhood. They feel strong connections. They felt valued by their family of origin. They felt nurtured and caretaken in their family, and they were assaulted on campus or at a frat party, and it was really maybe the first big trauma that they worked with. Oftentimes what we're seeing is we're not actually doing a lot of work with childhood. We're not oftentimes spending a lot of time in those little T traumas, those fundamental shifts of my understanding of myself. We're really working with the big T trauma itself. When I'm working with someone who experienced trauma in childhood, whether it was sexual trauma or not, we're always working from a place of their brain was required to develop around the trauma. It wasn't just integrated into their life, their brain developed around it. And although I think some of that can be the most beautiful work any of us do in all of living, it can feel pretty daunting to people. It can feel pretty overwhelming. I see Sterling is shaking his head vigorously. I think he may interact with clients at the hospital every once in a while that have probably complex trauma histories. And it is big. It's big. And you're also, again, recognizing that you're working with the person and deep held beliefs that develop over time. We talked about that when we talked about trauma. But when a developing brain is required to make sense of something, that it's really underprepared to make sense of and doesn't have grown-ups to help them do it, the developing brain stores it in whatever way it knows how. And usually that is by assigning blame um, to the child, to themselves. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but felt like a good place to throw that out. So as we're talking, understanding childhood trauma requires that we have a pretty good understanding of early development. For those of you at home, and also for you, Morgan, and you, Sterling, I think most of this material will be a review, but we're going to look at it through a little bit of a different lens. There are lots of theorists that you can look at for understanding development. If you're looking for a psychosocial development, that's going to be a different experience than looking for a biopsychosocial development. Or, if you're looking at Freudian concepts versus Piaget concepts or Erickson's model. For our purposes, we're talking about relationships here. We're talking about trauma that was caused in relationship. Most trauma, by the way, is caused in relationship, but not all trauma, right? Natural disasters aren't necessarily caused by relationship. However, sexual abuse of a young child is caused in a relationship, right? It's caused in a relationship. I think most of us, that are parents, go to this place of like, my kids can't be with strangers, my kids can't walk home by themselves. We have these sort of looming beliefs around us that a stranger could abuse or assault our child. That's so rare. Just like it's really rare that adults are assaulted by strangers. It's not unheard of and it's not impossible, but it's not typically what we're working with. We're almost always working with children that were abused in a relationship by someone that they trust or trusted. So understanding that requires that we really look at what are some of the goals of development in general. What are some of the phases and the stages that we go through in psychosocial development? And I would like to start off by saying I love Erickson's model, but I do think that sort of later towards the end of his career, he really started kind of backpedaling into he started with this infancy, toddler, preschooler, up to older age. But I think towards the end of his career, he really backpedaled into the most critical phase of development, which most social scientists and actual biologists agree on today, which is not up here. Any takers? Any guesses?
Ooh. I don't know.
Yeah, because it's
I
complex and most of us don't think of this, but it's the womb.
Oh.
The most critical phase, the most critical time when we are growing organs and experiencing sight, sound, taste, touch, self-soothing for the very first times in our lives. This is we're experiencing kind of development on methamphetamines. I mean, it's so rapid, right? It takes 9 months to grow an entire human. And it's funny when I do this presentation live in front of large groups, I like point to my belly the whole time. I'm not pregnant. I just think of it that way. So I want to talk a little bit about prenatal development. And only because it helps set the stage for the rest of development. But if I could ask you to revisit your own experience in the womb, which, we really can't, but if we think about it metaphorically, it's the development of all of our most fundamental physiological systems. So the central nervous system develops in the womb. Who, by the way, does the central nervous system take its cues from? Is it looking to someone outside of the womb, telling it how to manage anxiety or stress or things that shift or change? No, it's getting all of its cues from the organism it's inhabiting. So I regularly say this over and over again, and I'm going to say it again now because I want it to exist somewhere out on the internet, not because it's mine, but because it's important. Interacting with pregnant women in the most compassionate and kind ways is the single greatest thing you can do for the unborn child. The reason why is because the unborn child, although it has all of its own systems, right, that are beginning to develop, it is heavily reliant on the mother for navigating the experience of living. So, for example, children in the womb can be, at 6 months, they can hear, They can see light outside of the womb. They're exposed to much of what the mother's exposed to, and they experience the mother's reactions to it. So when a mother hears a really startling noise that the baby also hears, mother tenses up, right? Clenches fists, teeth grinding. And so our first introduction to navigating stress, anxiety, joy, self-soothing touch is in relation to our mothers. Now, many of you are sitting here, or those of you that are on the internet, and you're like, oh God, my mom had a really stressful pregnancy. Um, and I think the good news in that is it's one factor. It doesn't determine your life experience. It is a pretty important factor, though. So, what else takes place in the womb? First stage of development, we begin to experience all of our sensory input for the very first time: sight, sound, touch, taste, hearing, and we recognize that the other thing that is common for all of us in the womb is that it's dark, it's warm, we are connected to a constant source of food. We don't have to communicate that we have needs and that we would like those needs met. We're not even aware that we have needs because those needs are being met for the most part in utero, right? Then we have this the very first trauma of living, this experience of everything starts to tighten up. Everything's tightening. It's pushing me out. This doesn't feel good. I don't like it. Everything's tightening and we're moving downward, right? We're going through a really enclosed small space. And I'm not going to pretend like I know what the experience of being born is like, but I do know that the difference between the womb and exiting the womb, it's bright, it's loud. People are poking me. It's cold. People are touching me. I have this new sensation of hunger and I'm crying because I don't like it. Everything that I learned in the womb, that my world, in fact, is about me, right? I don't have that conscious thought, but nothing is telling me otherwise, right? Everything's about me. I'm now is being forced into question now that I'm out of here. I have to cry when my needs are met. I have to indicate that I'm uncomfortable, that I don't like things. And what's really fascinating about this is it sets the stage for every other stage of development, which is I'm kind of slowly but subtly learning that the world's not about me. And I don't like it. I don't like it. That's a huge loss, right? It's a huge loss. We're going to get here in just a minute, but in every single language worldwide, what are toddlers' very first words? At 1.5, 2 years old, what are the very first things they're communicating when they start communicating? Not repetition. They say mama, dada, not that. When they start communicating, I have something to say. Any guesses? First words. Those of you that are on the
Ooh, I
internet,
don't
I'm working with
know.
non-parents here. So
Yeah.
just going to put that out there. First words: no, 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 and mine. Mine, in some version of mine. I'm taking things, I have to protect myself, I have to protect the things around me because I'm slowly but subtly learning that this reality I lived for, the first several months of my development, the world is about me, everything is about me. This reality I lived is no longer the reality. And what we see in this, in development, is that that's an enormous amount of loss for all of us, right? We develop it, we visit it with a vengeance in toddlerhood. Everything's a fight. I'll do what I want. Don't tell me what to do. I'll run around if I want to. Don't take that from me. I'll eat it if I want to. And adolescence. We're revisiting this in the most intense way I think we ever do. I walk in a room, someone's laughing. I immediately know that they are laughing at the shirt that I purchased and I'm wearing for the first time today, and I will burn it to the ground and never wear it again, right? Everything's about us. So as we're looking at these different stages of development, I really just wanted to set the tone that we are all sort of naturally mourning that loss, that things aren't about us. That doesn't mean that we can't do it. We all do it, right? But it is a bit of a struggle to conceptualize and to work with. So really moving on beyond the birthplace, beyond development that takes place prenatally, we're really looking at infancy. And the focus of this, or according to Erickson's psychosocial stages of development, is that we're really focusing on this idea of developing trust. So I recently became aware that things aren't about me. I'm not sure how to conceptualize that. I have to be reminded day in and day out because I don't really have I don't have any abstract reasoning. And so I'm learning these things over and over again, and it's really painful. And when my caregivers respond to me, when they're responding to my crying, when they're responding to the smell of a diaper, when they're responding to my needs and meeting those, I'm not just learning to trust my primary caregivers. I'm actually learning, I'm putting on a lens, a pair of glasses over my eyes that say, I trust the world in general. I trust human beings. When my primary caregivers, for lots of different reasons, are unable or are not responding to my needs in what feels like a navigatable time period, I'm beginning to question, to mistrust human beings. Human beings are suspicious. They're not safe. This doesn't feel okay. I can't rely on other people. I am learning to rely on me. And this becomes complex, obviously, right? Because we do have to rely on other people for support and help throughout our lives. So in this experience, we're learning to trust the people around us based on how our caregivers respond to us, or to trust no one, to not trust people around us. And obviously, this can become really complex. Once we get through these stages of development, we're going to talk about how then does sexual abuse impact us at different stages of development. So we move on to our toddlerhood or toddlership. I don't know if either of those are a word, but I'm going to use them for our purposes today, where the main focuses of our work is autonomy. I can do things on my own. I'm starting to learn how to do things on my own. I used to just cry in a crib and everybody had to meet all my needs all the time. And now I'm learning, actually, I can do some things. I can pick up my cup. I can use my fork. I can put my own shirt on, or at least put my hands up when I need my shirt on. I can feed myself some things. I can color. I can do lots of things for myself. And what I'm learning in this process, it's the greatest task of development as a toddler, is I'm learning autonomy. I can rely on myself for some things. When I'm not able to learn that I can rely on myself for some things, when I have a hovering parent, or when my parents constantly telling me I'm not enough, I can't do enough, I'm being told no all the time, I regularly will learn to doubt myself and to doubt my ability to contribute. So this can become tricky for toddlers, especially because self-sufficiency is their goal. They're learning to rely on themselves. Then we move right up into these preschool and early school years where we're focused on initiative versus guilt. So I want you to think back on early childhood, preschool folks. And it's tricky because you're not parents, but I'm going to tell you about an experience that I think is universal, wherein children from ages 3 to 6 begin doing things. They build things, they make things, they color things. And every single thing they do, they want an audience for. Every single thing. Not only do they want an audience, it's like I have two stories about this. I have a 2-year-old now. He will jump on the trampoline for hours and hours and hours, and he never gets tired of what, mom, what, mama, what. Obviously, he wants an audience for this, right? And every single thing he does, he then stands up and claps for himself, right? Because he's learning that he has initiative and he can contribute in the world. I have a niece. This is a pretty hilarious story. She was 3 years old. It was nap time. She was taking a nap. She'd recently gotten a tea set for Christmas, and she was supposed to be sleeping. Her mom comes up an hour later, hear noise in the room, walks in, sees that she's taken her own diaper off. She had gone number 2, divided it up into equal parts, and distributed it on all the tea plates for each of her teddy bears to have their own cookies for lunch. And the only thing she wanted from her mom was recognition for how creative she was and that she had set up her own tea party. What do you think mom's reaction to that was? Oh God, I don't know what to make of this, right? So we recognize that during this period of development, 3 to 6 years old, kids are looking to those around them to reinforce and validate that what they have contributed or what they've done in the world matters. When they don't experience that reinforcement, that validation, they experience guilt. I should be different than I am. I see these other people being um, validated. I should be different than I am. So we're starting off a little bit on rocky ground, right? When we're not able to validate these things. And I think what's tricky is no parent's perfect, right? No parent is able to do this all the time. It's just not a thing, ever. All of our parents were inevitably going to fail us, right? But we're looking for some generalities. We're looking for this happened a good chunk of the time. All right, moving on. 6 to 12 years old, this is kind of elementary school age. This is when we're really starting to look to our peers to tell us that we're okay. First, we're looking to primary caregivers to model for us and navigate that we're okay the way we are. Then we jump into elementary school, and now all of a sudden, I saw someone passing out invitations to birthdays and I didn't get one. What does that mean about me, right? We're starting to look to our peers to tell us if we're acceptable. We've moved beyond just our primary caregivers or families of origin. Um, so during this period of development, a lot of industry versus inferiority. It's really important to these kids, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, to get the smiley face on their paper, to get the sticker saying what you've done from your teacher is helpful, to get invited to the birthday party, to really be seen and heard by their peers, right? First, I want to be seen and heard by mom and dad. Now, I want to be seen and heard by the people around me. When that doesn't take place, young children experience feelings of inferiority and they really struggle with feelings of mastery that I can navigate the world and do okay because I'm looking to other people to tell me if I'm doing okay. Thank you. And last of all, for our purposes today, when looking at development, we're going to talk about adolescence. Um, I have been a therapist for approximately 13 years now, and it doesn't matter how great your adolescence was. You could have been the captain of the football team or the head cheerleader. I've yet to meet anyone who wants to go back, ever. Just because so much is happening, right? Those of you that are watching from home, both Morgan and Sterling did laugh slightly. Um, anyway, back to this adolescence idea. Our focus is we're returning almost with a vengeance to this idea that my value is determined by the people around me. There's a, a a theoretical concept about adolescence called the looking glass perspective, meaning that I am looking to everyone to tell me my worth or my value. And we recognize that this is a pretty tricky time of biological development as well, right? We're growing different body parts that we had not developed before. We're experiencing body hair, we're experiencing hormone, we're experiencing a lot of fluctuation and change in the body, and the brain is being asked to keep up with that. And it can be complex, it can be hard. So during adolescence, our focus is on identity. Who am I? In a world where that's an ongoing question, one that never ends, right? Our focus is on um, being able, sort of when we're able to connect to identity, we're being able to connect to ideas that are basic. I matter in the world. I'm seen and heard. I'm okay the way I am. Now, no one feels that way all the time, but when I'm not able to touch any of that, when I'm not able to touch a sense of mattering to someone, um, that becomes really tricky. I then look really strongly to my peers to tell me where I fit. This is where, understanding concepts like gang affiliation and mean girls or like sort of posses that exist, it makes sense because we're really looking to others to tell us where we fit or where we belong. Um, this all, I'm going to skip back just for a second. This all becomes really important in understanding how old someone was when they experienced trauma. So that is true for trauma in general, but for our purposes today, we're talking about sexual abuse. We're talking about sexual trauma. So when I'm working with someone who was abused at age 6, I very well may be working, I very well may be working with someone who really struggled to develop feelings of self-mastery, that I can be validated in the world, or that got disrupted to some extent. It doesn't mean that it had to be, but it's a good thing to look at when you're working with someone that was abused at a very specific age. They're now being forced to develop their brain around this thing they were unable to make sense of. And they did the best job that they could in that. So I want us to do a little pause, a little activity here that's going to allow us to think about the way our own brains have developed, the way we experience things. So I'm going to ask those of you that are here with me and those of you that are listening from home today, um, I'd like you to think about an event that feels distressing to you. So whether that's mildly distressing or maybe medium distressing, I'm not looking for the worst trauma of your life. But if you recently had an interaction with a boss or a coworker, a friend, or a family member wherein you did not feel good afterwards, you didn't feel great, kind of did what the brain does. You felt something you don't like over here in the right hemisphere of the brain. You jump ship really quickly into the left hemisphere. What am I going to do about this, right? Anything you can think of didn't feel great. Most likely, a good indication that you were distressed was you immediately started trying to control things. How am I going to navigate this? What do I do about it? So, as you're thinking about this, I want you to just notice in this experience, I'd like you to identify an image that best represents it. An image that represents the thing that feels really distressing to you. As you're thinking about that, you may notice like some sensations in the body, like you start to tighten up. I don't want to think about this. I'm really good at not thinking about this. I don't want to think about it. I've become an expert on not being with this distress. Everybody got something? Okay. They're shaking their heads for those of you watching at home. You don't necessarily need to share it with me. But I want you to ask yourself this question. If you're comfortable, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a minute. I'm going to do it too. I want you to ask yourself, as you're looking at this image that represents the distressing experience, you're noticing body sensations you have. What are you believing about yourself in this? And if your first thought is to go towards another person or the other person in the experience, great. You're believing something about them. What are you also believing about yourself? Maybe because they're behaving this way, they don't respect me. I'm not seen. I don't matter. I'm not important. Or maybe your first thought was how you should be different. So you're experiencing this distress, and your thought is, if I had done this, or if I was different than I am. What are you believing about yourself? What does that say about you? And as you're sitting with that idea, what does that say about you? I want you to try to think of another time you thought or believed that. Whatever you're believing, is there another time you thought this about yourself or believed this about yourself? Now, think of another time. Is there another time you thought this or you believe this about yourself? They're both shaking their heads. I'm shaking my head too. And now I want you to just take a minute. Can you remember the first time you felt that way? Or the first time you believed that about yourself? And if you can't, that's okay. So we're just going to take a pause there. I actually want to ask both of you what that was like for you. I'll give you a second to think of it, though, what you would like to share. For me, what I was focusing on was a conflict that I had in a relationship that's really important to me. A conflict in this relationship, and because I didn't have all the information, I started filling it in with details, and the details were all the worst things. This person doesn't respect me. They don't care about this thing that's really important to me. How can I ever trust them? Um, and then inevitably it came back to me. What does this say about me? If this person I really care about, I can't trust. That feels so devastating to me. Why am I not enough in this? I don't know if you're following my line of thinking. This doesn't feel good. It shouldn't be this way. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with me? I'm wondering, as I outline that pattern, this doesn't feel good. It shouldn't be this way. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with me? Is that something either one of you can relate to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was interesting to feel my path of thought kind of naturally progress in that way as we were doing that exercise, because it does just like, if you, it felt like it was much more ingrained in my processing than I would have maybe liked or thought it was. I don't know. Yeah, it just like was a very like carved in pathway I could feel in like the way I was thinking.
Yeah, Morgan, I love the way you're describing that, because neurons that fire together, ideas that fire together, begin to wire together. So the path gets carved out so deeply in your brain that you follow that trajectory of what's wrong with me. And we talked about this in the trauma presentation. Remember, the reptilian brain, without your permission, is scanning your environment for evidence of these things you're believing. We're looking for evidence of them. The reverse is also true. When I'm working with early childhood trauma survivors, the reverse is also true. Anything we're looking for, we can find. But when it's so deeply ingrained, this pathway, kind of that Robert Frost poem about the road less traveled, right? We know this direction to go down this path of what's wrong with me, to go down other or various ways of thinking about it or relating to our distress. It takes a lot of practice. It's hard. It can be done. People do it all the time. But it's not our natural, we're not driven to do it. What about you, Sterling? Any reactions you had in it or experience you had?
So my experience was, kind of just went back to a reoccurring thought, a self-doubt of mine. Um, just thinking of the one experience that kind of reinforces something that I've always thought before. Yeah, it's just like one more nail in there holding that thought together.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that was an excellent segue to our next slide. Um, our negative, what we call kind of in the therapeutic world or the psychological world, is negative cognitions, but what makes more sense in that is our beliefs about ourselves. So this one that you're saying is reoccurring, this sort of negative belief that you've kind of sat with and stirred around for a while, percolated in your brain, so to speak. They become lenses through which we view and experience the world. So oftentimes as a therapist, I'm sitting across from someone, and our number one goal is identifying, like, help me understand the pair of glasses that you're seeing the world through. Again, remember, it doesn't matter what happened to you. It matters how you remember it, how you stored it. I had an underdeveloped brain. This thing happened. I couldn't make sense of it. I brought out the judge. I brought out the jury. I collected all the evidence I could get as a 3-year-old, as a 4-year-old, as a 7-year-old, and I cast a verdict. And I think so often our work, whether we do it on our own or with a therapist, is, oh, hey, I've got a fully developed brain now. I have the ability to utilize abstract reasoning and see other people's perspectives and internalize material differently. But when trauma is a component in it, when I literally could not make sense of the thing that occurred for me, I couldn't make sense of it. I stored it in a way that felt um, not so secure. And it pops up over and over and over again. It's popping up. And I'm looking for evidence of these beliefs about myself. In everything, in every relationship I have, I'm looking for evidence of these things. What's interesting is unless we kind of experience some effective shifts in the way we relate to ourselves, which I joke all the time when people sit across from me and they're like, I'd like you to change me. I'm like, oh, I don't do that. But almost every other therapist, behavioral therapist you find will tell you they do that. So go work with them because it's not what I do. My focus is on shifting the way we're relating to ourselves, what's already there. So I see, Melinda, that when you, because of your early childhood experiences, your early childhood trauma, you have a perpetual belief that people want you to go away. It's present in everything. So every time you're a human, you make a mistake, you're not perfect, you're not a perfect parent, you're not a perfect partner, you're not anything. This percolates around, and this is just more proof that people want me to go away. People don't want me around, right? I'm looking for this evidence, so I do find it, right? When we can begin working with that, oh, here's that thing again. Here's that thing again. We're able to do really great work with it. It may never go away, right? Your brain developed around it. It may always be a part of your reality. It just doesn't have to be the reality. It's a part of it. So identifying some of these beliefs is so critical to who we are as people. What did I make sense of with an underdeveloped brain and decide that was the truth of me? And how am I now looking for it in other environments and situations that I'm in, right? I think this becomes particularly prominent, like I said, in early childhood trauma, because that's when we're forced to do the most work. We're using the most brain power to make sense of material we aren't able to make sense of. We don't know how to make sense of. So back up here to the slides. I'm going to point us back here. When we talk about the goal of the brain is to organize material and store it, right? When we experience trauma, in the process of organizing distressing experiences and information, the developing brain does one thing. Two things, actually. The developing brain looks to assign blame because I don't know how to make sense of what's happening. I need an anchor. This thing that's happening, my grandfather is sexually abusing me. I don't know how to make sense of this. I don't know how to be with this. I don't know what it means about me. I don't know what it means about him. I just heard my dad punch the wall and I heard a body hit the ground in the room next to me. I don't know how to make sense of this. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means about them. I don't know what it means about me. I need an anchor. And most readily, the anchor is blame. You're bad or I'm bad. As we develop, we get more in the habit of blaming others, right? I don't want to be with the pain of like blaming myself, right? And arguably, you could say that that is actually turns on us as well too. But for small children, they're being asked to choose between this is your fault, something's wrong with you, and this is my fault, something's wrong with me. My question for you today is for a small child. Remember, the most powerless time of anyone's life is childhood. You literally have the least power, right? When you grow up, it's like, I spend my money on what I want, do what I want. I mean, most people still feel really powerless, but nothing is as powerless as childhood, right? When I'm faced with trauma, especially in a relationship, this person's abusing me, this person's abusing my mother, this person's abusing my father, this thing is happening, I can't make sense of. We're left with two choices. This is your fault, this is my fault. Which option provides a sense of power or ability to influence the situation?
If it's your fault, you have more power over it.
Bingo. If this is my fault, if this is about me, I can just change. I can become good enough. I can work my ass off so that I'm not bad. Grandpa must be doing this to me because I'm dirty. I just need to become undirty. I just need to become okay. Right? And I think what's so interesting in our work, working with sexual abuse survivors, is that we talk about this in the trauma presentation, but because of our own distress, we sit across from someone who says, I know this is my fault. And our immediate response is, oh my God, it's not your fault. And I always ask people as advocates to just slightly alter that. It was required that the child choose this. I'm not okay the way I am. I can learn to be different. I can become perfect in A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I can become a badass at this, and this. You will see me. You will be proud of me. I will never, ever make a mistake. I will be type A, perfect to the bottoms of the earth, right? That's not everyone's response, but for lots of us, that is our response, right? It's the right choice. Because not only does it change feelings of powerlessness, it changes our belief in hope and our ability to move forward. If my grandfather is sexually abusing me, if my father is sexually abusing me, and my mom knows about it, and she's not doing anything, I must be really bad. I must really have done something wrong. I should have thought of this. I should have said this. I should have done this differently. It provides hope. I can be better. I can change this. If the other person's just fundamentally bad, I'm stuck. There's nothing I can do about this. I don't know how I'll survive this. I don't know how I can get out of it. So regularly I will respond to survivors when they say to me, I'm bad, I'm yucky, I'm dirty. I know this happened to me because blah, 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 blah. I have a client that I've worked with for several years. She had 4 different perpetrators before she was 10 years old. The conclusion was easily, I'm disgusting. I'm really bad. I'm gross. I think what's interesting in that is taking that entirely away from them by saying, oh my God, it wasn't your fault, creates some friction. I don't know if I can trust you. I know this thing to my core, and it's kept me alive. So oftentimes when people say that to me, I'll say, I hear you saying that this feels really, really, really painful. It's really hard for you to sit with this. I hear you saying it feels like you did something to deserve this. That makes sense to me. And I know that the only person responsible for abuse, for rape, is the perpetrator. It's the and in it. It's not the if or the but. Does that make sense? Like sitting with the validation of, it makes sense to me that you feel this way. It makes sense to me that you had to make sense of a lot of really difficult stuff as a very small child. It makes sense to me that this became your response. That makes sense to me. And I know that this is not your fault. I'm wondering if you all are having any thoughts or reactions to this as we're talking. Anything coming up for you?
Oh, it's very powerful. So I think I'm feeling a lot of emotions for sure, thinking about my childhood.
Sure.
But it all makes complete sense too. So it's very equally powerful in that way.
And I'm thinking back to like as early as I can remember, just trying to apply this to different things, and so say, okay, this is why I reacted this way, or that's why I felt this way for so long, stuff like that. I'm just applying it to all these different experiences. And
Yeah, I think parts of it can feel really validating. Like, oh, of course that's how I made sense of this, right? I feel like I kind of have the best job in the world because I'm like, right, yeah, you took this and this and this and you put them together and you were 7 and this is what you decided. I think you're brilliant. I think I probably would have decided the same thing. I also hear that it's maybe not working for you anymore. and that we may want to work with that a little bit, shift that material. Um, so as I presented this information, I really want us to take a minute to look at these case examples and just um, I said earlier that in our work as advocates, nothing really works better for us than being present with ourselves, right? Nothing is more important than being able to respond with kindness and support to what's coming up for me, right? Because if I'm grounded, if I'm present, I have the ability to be present for the person across from me and bring them back, right? Bring them into the space. So I'm going to use a couple, we're going to do 2 client examples before we wrap up. And I just want to ask a couple of questions. I'm going to ask each of you to respond really with your reaction to it. Your questions are more so about you than they are the client, okay? So this is the first one. You've got it up in front of you too at home. So this is Sarah. When I was a little girl, my grandpa used to take all the grandkids to the movies, feed us treats before dinner, let us drive the tractor, and play with us past bedtime. He was everyone's favorite. He paid more attention to me than anyone in my life ever had. He started molesting me when I was 8 and told me it was because I was his favorite. I really wanted to be his favorite. After a while, I knew it was because I was dirty. I was bad. It never occurred to me to tell anyone. Why would I? No one would believe me. And I really loved my grandpa. So I want to ask both of you and those of you at home, what's coming up for you in this? What reactions do you notice in your body? What thoughts do you have?
I think an initial thought is that it sounds familiar to me as someone working with clients, as that type of self story seems familiar in that way. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Just kind of like what Morgan said. It just seems familiar. It's like, oh, I've recognized this. I've seen this before.
Okay. So Sarah, who is a client of mine, this is a client story that we've changed the details and the information, but Sarah is a client of mine. Sarah, in her experience, every time she has interacted with someone and told the truth of her experience, people go straight to, oh my God, your grandpa is a monster. How disgusting, how despicable. What are your guesses about what that experience is like for her to navigate?
Well, um, it would be hard for someone to be telling you not to love someone that you do, even if they've hurt you. Like you can still have those feelings at the same time and have them be different and have pain and love. So I think that would be really invalidating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complex because I think the secondary trauma in it is I don't also get to feel what I feel in this experience. I'm sitting with how ridiculously confusing this is to me. And now I'm responsible for taking care of you in it. Any other thoughts? Did you notice any judgments of how Sarah should have felt? Did anything feel congruent with what you understand about trauma response or what we just talked about with the developing brain?
Yeah, this sounds. It does sound like typical trauma response, especially when it's someone that you love deeply. Um, it's not wanting to tell anyone, like that just seems normal.
Sure. And when you're asked to be in that position of you should hate this person that was such a fundamental part of your life, it has this really interesting impact on the psyche, which is no one's acceptable in their humanity. I can't be with hating my grandpa and loving him. I have to pick one. And then I also have to interact with myself that way. I'm either good or bad. When in reality, we know that as human beings, we're sitting with the truth of both. I'm imperfect. I make errors. I make mistakes. Can I be with that and with I matter? So now we're reinforcing those early cognitions that we talked about earlier, which is I'm bad. And when we start to see the world through that lens, there's no room for both. People can do bad things, be bad, and I can care about them. Those can exist at the same time. But we as a society reinforce for each other that they cannot. And we can't, what happens in the brain, and this maybe is getting a little too deep, but fragmentation of the brain, I start to turn on different parts of myself. So I want to move to one more scenario. We won't get to our third one today, but, well, actually, you know what? We will get to our third one. All right. This is Ray. I started Scouts when I was 8 years old. My parents were worried about me because I didn't have any friends, and they wanted me to make friends. My Scoutmaster always took a special interest in me and said it was because I reminded him of his favorite brother. He picked me up every week and dropped me off. He bought me my first camping gear because my parents couldn't afford it. When he asked to sleep next to me at the first campout, I felt really important. The other kids thought I was important too. In the middle of the night, he started molesting me. I didn't know what was happening and was confused about what to do. I really did want him to like me. He told me that it wasn't wrong because we cared about each other. I did care about him. And I knew if I told anyone, I couldn't come to Scouts anymore. I knew if I told, I'd lose my Scout friends. Again, what are you noticing is coming up in you?
Um, well, I think then this is like super obvious, but sadness for
Yeah.
the small child that was harmed in this. Um, and I think definitely, again, feeling familiarity with hearing that the fear of being isolated from another community and that like a group of friends or support system, because that's, again, like a valid concern and fear want to
Right.
have. So,
Yeah, especially after we just went through, the goals of development. This kid's 11, 12 years old. His focus is on what do my peers think of me? Validation around me. Any anger? Do we feel any anger? Usually when I share this one, people are like, I just want to punch that guy in the face. And I'm like, yeah, that's another conversation we can talk about when we talk about perpetration. But I do think it's so complex, right? I'm holding at the same time feelings of being important and mattering,
yeah.
being special, with really confusing, sad, painful experiences. Um, any thoughts about how Ray should have felt or acted? Or anything that made sense to you or seemed congruent with trauma response?
Yeah, the way you say like should have reacted is it kind of just it triggered something in me like there's no way to properly react to this. Like nothing you do is ever going to be more right than anything else.
Yeah. There's no wrong way to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think it's so important to like really reinforce that for survivors over and over again is you are responding to an abnormal life experience in a very normal way. You're being asked to hold impossible things. And in this case, you're being asked to hold them with a very young developing brain. That's an impossible task for anyone. All right, our third scenario. This is Jane. My mom remarried my stepdad when I was in middle school. I never liked him that much. He always seemed a little creepy to me. He was always saying stuff about how beautiful he thought I was. One night he came into my room and started molesting me. I froze and didn't know what to do. I tried telling my mom, but she didn't believe me. After that night, I became paranoid that the same thing would happen to my younger siblings. Every time he came into my room at night, I just laid there frozen. Because if I let him do this to me, then maybe he wouldn't do it to them. And I really wanted to protect them. Again, same questions. What's coming up for you?
It actually kind of relate to this because I always want to protect, especially people close to me. So I'm really relating to Jane.
Yeah, that makes sense. That kind of lay on the sword to protect the people I care about.
Exactly.
Especially when you're so little. Yeah, did you have any judgments or thoughts about how Jane should have felt or acted?
And no, just back to what I said on the last example. It's like there is no good way to do this, to
Yeah.
go about this.
Yeah. I love that. I love that thought. There isn't a right way to show up in this. Does anything make sense to you or seem congruent with trauma response or trauma exposure?
Yeah, since there's like no real right way and everyone is so different, I guess it does kind of fit into it relates to other things I've seen
Yeah.
since, but it's just so many different possible reactions that could happen that I'm sure it fits in somewhere.
Yeah, I always think about her comment about freezing. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't move. And we know, in looking at trauma, the body releases hormones that allow us to freeze for survival. And especially as a teenager, you're navigating that and it can feel so complex. Yeah. So I think kind of in closing, I know that all three of those examples are really painful to be with because we're talking about little children. Just in closing, um, I always encourage people, that are doing advocacy work or even just being a friend in the world. When someone says, I know this is my fault, being able to validate, like, sure, like, it makes sense to me that you might feel that way. And I know no child is responsible for this. Being able to validate their lived experience, I hear you, I see you, when the entire experience in and of itself was built around not being seen and heard. Recognizing how abuse can affect clients differently at different stages of development can really be critical to look at. So, I think sometimes we work with people who we feel like are just overly controlling, overly dramatic. And I think if you look at these stages of development where they don't feel safe in the world because they weren't able to be supported in their autonomy, they weren't supported in their initiative, it would make sense that their coping skills developed around perfection or feeling that they can never do anything right. And if we're telling the truth about that, all of us struggle with those things, right? Like, I mean, I point that out over and over again, like just navigating childhood and staying alive and not coming out with multiple negative cognitions is a very small, I mean, that's a very large feat, right? Like, we all struggle with those things. And being able to expand that definition of trauma allows us to relate to early childhood trauma better. To some extent, we're all early childhood trauma survivors. Not, I say that. Not everyone experiences it to the same extent, but definitely expanding that definition of trauma helps us to be more present with clients. I think lastly, seeking to understand as opposed to fixing or changing. Fixing or changing reinforces, yes, you're right. That negative thing you believe about yourself, you're not enough. You're not okay the way you are. When someone's like, yes, you should do this differently. You should be this way. It's just reinforcing that, right? Like, oh yeah, so you agree, I'm not okay the way I am. As opposed to seeking to understand, what's it like for you? What's it like for you to have made this call? What's it like for you to share that with a stranger? What was it like for you to walk into the hospital today knowing that you were going to share some of these things? I think seeking to understand is the only level of support that really supports. Doesn't mean we don't look for options in that, it's so interesting to work with advocates over and over again because I'm like, there isn't always a right answer. There's not always an answer to what you're trying to do, but the right option is always seeking to understand. You'll never go wrong in that. Never. So in closing, I, I just want to encourage each of you, those of you that are here and also those of you that are listening from home, to really think about when you're working with a complex trauma survivor, you're not just working with the big T's. You're working with the little T's, the beliefs that I've developed about myself over time related to my early trauma that I experienced, and recognizing that the more you can get to know those and be warm and open to them, the more you're going to be able to support the client. Thank you very much.